Thank you, Steve and Jonathan, for setting us up. So Barry and I are going to co-present here. So Jonathan told us a bit about, I guess they're both taller than I am. There we go. Jonathan presented an overview of what a PFDD is and what it can do for people with different indications. He gave us some great examples. And Steve talked about a lot of challenges in the research process. And what Barry and I are going to talk about is an initiative to begin a PFDD process in spinal cord injury. So we're looking at what can a PFDD process do for our community. So we began this with a white paper that was initiated by SCOPE and NASCIC. You'll hear more about both organizations, and you'll hear the output of the white paper, which will be submitted for publication soon. So a little bit about SCOPE. SCOPE is the Spinal Cord Outcome Partnership Endeavor. We are a subsidiary of the American Spinal Injury Association. And relevant to PFDD, we are an academic industry agency partnership. We focus on clinical trials, clinical trial outcomes and endpoints, which you've heard about both from Jonathan and particularly from Steve in relation to spinal cord injury. So that is kind of our space, if you will. And SCOPE is co-led by myself and Jane Shea. And Jane actually identified the PFDD effort and brought it to SCOPE and gained SCOPE's support to initiate this effort. Unfortunately, Jane was not able to join us today, so I'm presenting on behalf of SCOPE. SCOPE partners, you will see many of the partners represented here at this meeting. So our partners range from industry sponsors to nonprofit organizations in the spinal cord space, nonprofit funding agencies, and contract research organizations. We also have diverse membership. We have prominent spinal cord injury researchers from different organizations. We have representatives from governmental organizations. So we have a very diverse membership. You can find more about our membership on our website. Some of our recent accomplishments. We recently completed a manuscript on data safety monitoring boards. So these are the boards that monitor safety and data integrity in a clinical trial. But we created a publication on relevance to spinal cord injury. What are the special considerations? And you can see some of the names that are highlighted here, and in some of our other endeavors are people that are here in this room or represented in this room. And that resulted, again, in a publication. We also, there were a number of seminal clinical trials that have recently been completed. You'll hear a lot about some of those trials tomorrow, but we felt it was time for a clinical trial update. So in 2023, we hosted a half-day clinical trial update in conjunction with Spinal Research, and that was a workshop which the manuscript for that has been submitted. And then most recently in May, we hosted a workshop on biomarkers, and this workshop ranged from looking at biomarkers at the molecular level, which is what we most commonly think about in terms of biomarkers, but we looked all the way through movement. So this was a one-day workshop, and the results of this will be submitted, or the discussion will be submitted for publication. And what's not up here, really relevant to the PFDD discussion, is we also had 2 manuscripts looking at upper and lower extremity outcome measures and their strengths and challenges in the context of clinical trials. So our outcomes work is really relevant to PFDD. So now Barry is going to tell us about NASCIC.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everybody. These are exciting times because I can say personally, as someone, as a person with lived experience that had an injury over 38 years ago, no, I wasn't in the video that the doctor showed us, but sometimes I feel like I was, because it really was a desert back in the days when we were all asking about research and what can we do to make change. And there was so much reliance on the trusteeship, I used to call it, putting all our trust in researchers to go ahead and fix this thing and help us out. We'll raise you the money and you'll take care of it. Well, that didn't really work out, and we're realizing that all the time. But what's happened is that we learned something along the way, that it does take all of us as stakeholders to be part of this massive research team to do that. Next slide, please. So in recent history, what really changed was in 2016, there was a conference in Vancouver and it was called the Praxis Conference, put on originally by the Rick Hansen Institute, now called Praxis, my employer. I'll just declare that, great group. And what they did was, it was a genesis of starting the difference between when they invited people with lived experience to come to a scientific conference talking about research, and then the nature of research was so darn depressing that we sat there, not only was it depressing in here and there wasn't a lot going on, but more importantly, that we were all on the sidelines watching as observers. And what generated after that was the idea of we need to come together as a community, not angry, but we need to be equal partners in research and stakeholders, much like other conditions are doing at the same time. So what came out of that was the creation of the North American SCI Consortium. And the whole idea was to bring together all the community groups throughout North America that are involved in SCI, not just research, but in everything, where we can work together and see how we can have common ground and unify our voices. But we also realized in that creation, it wasn't just about the people with lived experience in community organizations. We wanted stakeholders, we wanted individuals, we wanted academia, and all of you in this room today. We wanted everybody at the table so we can have this unified conversation. And then our first real coming out party was in 2019 at the NIH conference. It was looking at the next, called 2020, A Decade of Disruption, looking at the next 10 years of SCI research. And as you know, the NIH is the largest funder of SCI research in the world. And what was different is we had a chance to speak to it. First time that people with lived experience spoke to it. But before we went into that meeting, we actually surveyed our community. In 36 days, we had over 1,800 responses. Now, some of the academics here go, "Ooh, how did you do that?" And we asked them, what did you think? Where do you think your role in research is? What do you know about that? And it was almost majority coming back saying, we don't feel a part of it. I've given up hope. I don't understand any of it. And I'm not sure what my role is in the first place. And that was telling. And we took that, and it was that flag that we decided to carry and brought that into what do we do to fix that? Well, the first thing we felt we had to do was we had to create capacity. We want to be at the table, but we might not have the confidence to be at the table to tell our own truths. And we learned from breast cancer survivors, Parkinson's, MS, that they went back into their own community and they taught them about research. They taught them about process. They helped them better understand the landscape. By doing that, they were more confident and they can speak their truth. So that was the dawning of the SCA Research Advocacy course, which is available today. It's free. And it's an online course basically walking people through the different components of research. It gives the lay descriptions of all research. But what it did was give people the foundation so that they can talk and speak about research. Next slide. So really just to go back about NASCIC, because it's important that you know what we do, that in 2018 we were formed. Our membership is almost 60 community organizations, 336 individuals, I call them free agents, and 116 partner organizations, and many in the room here today are part of that too. And our mission to bring about unified achievements in research, care, and cure, policy by supporting collaborative efforts and across the spinal cord injury community. But this is my favorite part. To achieve this mission, we identify the gaps, we communicate resources, and we as a community become a conduit of collaboration. That's what NASCIC is all about, but frankly, NASCIC is everybody. And that's the exciting part of what we're doing, and frankly, it's evolved into what we're talking about today, and we really just seem to be fitting right into that part of it. Next slide. That's an example of the organizations that are involved on the community side. Next slide. Then we have our partner organizations. You can recognize them. Many great groups that we work with, and it just keeps adding and adding. Next slide.
Thanks, Barry. So I'm going to start off by summarizing the white paper. So I think you can see based on the presentation from SCOPE and NASCIC between Barry and I, why those two organizations working together were a great start to the PFDD effort. But as Jonathan talked about, PFDD efforts are driven by people with spinal cord injury. So SCOPE's role was really just one to kick it off, and we anticipate that the community will take the effort from here. So our kickoff, as mentioned, was a white paper that we developed that will be submitted for publication. And our objective in developing this white paper was really to provide guidance on how do we do a PFDD and what can it mean to spinal cord injury. What are the steps that we need to take? What are the things that we need to consider? So it's really just the beginning to kickstart the effort. And what were our methodologies that inform the white paper? So you'll see some of these individuals represented here. So we conducted interviews. Actually, a vendor that we worked with, HLG, helped us to conduct interviews of people with different expertise in spinal cord injury, ranging from people with spinal cord injury who are researchers who have expertise in advocacy and patient priorities for people living with spinal cord injury, representatives from industry, people with expertise in outcome measures, physicians who care for people with spinal cord injury, and we also interviewed an individual with significant PFDD experience. So those were our methods. And we asked 4 key questions. The first question was, what can a PFDD effort do for people living with spinal cord injury? And the second question was, how can we narrow the scope? As you are all well aware, and I'll talk about in a few minutes, spinal cord injury is heterogeneous. And even within the heterogeneity of spinal cord injury, people are heterogeneous. Everybody has different things that are important to them in their lives. How do we capture that information? So I'll present on the first 2 key questions, and then Barry will present on the second 2. The second 2 being, what are special considerations for organizing a PFDD meeting for people with spinal cord injury? What are some of the physical barriers that we need to consider? Travel is not easy. Barry can speak to this. And what are the financial considerations? As Jonathan mentioned, although the FDA doesn't say you need someone to organize this effort, it's a huge effort, and we believe that you do need external support to organize these efforts. So our first key question was, how can a PFDD affect people with spinal cord injury? And we believe that it can improve outcomes by identifying, informing, and promoting in different areas. So spinal cord injury, this image on the left is very complex, but hopefully what you can see is that there are a lot of organ systems that are represented in that image. So the lay public thinks about spinal cord injury, they think about motor outcomes, but there are a lot of systems that are affected. People think about walking, but as we know, based on Kim Anderson's publication, that is not the most important thing to a lot of people living with spinal cord injury. So it's really important that we understand the priorities. There has been additional work on priorities since that time. We also need to understand what are the areas that are important to develop interventions for, and how do we do that? So, and how do we run clinical trials to what Steve talked about, that A, can have impact on people living with spinal cord injury, but that people living with spinal cord injury contribute the design of our clinical trials, to the outcomes that we use, to consideration of the burden for people within clinical trials. And what's the risk-benefit ratio? That's not a conversation that we've really had, but that has occurred in PFDD meetings. So what is the tolerance of a community? Obviously, it comes down to an individual for a risk-benefit ratio. And what are the outcome measures and endpoints that we'll use to assess the outcomes in our clinical trials? We have a number of outcome measures, but we have a lot of gaps. So if, for example, the community identifies a certain system that they believe is really important that we assess in clinical trials, we need to be able to measure the output. So if we're looking at impact on, let's say, autonomic dysfunction, we need to be able to objectively measure changes as a result of the clinical trial. And there are gaps in our outcome measures. We don't have any FDA-acknowledged ubiquitous outcome measures. And the FDA has a qualification program. There are none for spinal cord injury, but even taking a step back, there are none that are universally recognized or even used within our community. So these are some of the things that we think a PFDD can do for our community. But how do we narrow the scope? We know that spinal cord injury is heterogeneous. It's not one size fits all. Just like you can't talk to me as a human being and know what's important to Joanna as an example, we have heterogeneity of the clinician and different people with differing needs. So how do we fit this all into a meeting? People may differ in terms of their needs, in terms of the location and severity of their spinal cord injury. A person with tetraplegia who has limited hand function may have different priorities than a person with paraplegia who has full use of their upper extremities. And what is the severity of the spinal cord injury? How severely impacted are the organ systems that we mentioned? And needs differ and priorities differ based on chronicity of spinal cord injury. A person with an acute spinal cord injury may have different priorities than a person with chronic injury who may be in a wheelchair versus ambulatory. So these are all considerations for a PFDD meeting. So our recommendation for deciding on the scope of the first PFD meeting is to initiate a patient preference survey and be informed by the needs of the community. We also need to understand what's in the literature now and how far have we come from some of these patient preference surveys. Do we need more patient preference surveys? And how have they actually impacted the clinical trials that are going on now? So we sort of need a landscape overview before we launch into this effort. And the results of those efforts will inform us on where we should start with a PFDD. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barry for key question number 3.
Thanks, Linda. So as you can see, question number 3 was, what are the special considerations for organizations organizing a PFDD meeting that allows for the representative SCI patient perspective? And this is a challenge. And us, originally when we started out with NASCIC, next slide please, we realized that there is such diverse groups of individuals throughout all of our community, even with our own community organizations. We're dealing with such a different population all the time, much like many other causes that have to go through this. But the organizers, we have to face the unique barriers, and we have to look at the distinctions between other communities, and we have to look at the variety of groups within our community. We have been trying to do that as we go along, but we know going forward, if we want to get this thing right, we have to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible. We're dealing with language barriers, we're dealing with socioeconomic issues, we're dealing with color, we're dealing with everything. And we can honestly say that we're starting that process even now, before there even was a PFDD. And I know a lot of the bigger community organizations are trying to do that and reflect as many as they can. The difference in the populations between their injuries and their representation when it comes to SCI clinical trials is terrible. We need to change that. And so one of the things and the positive things about going through this process is that we're actually galvanizing, and I've heard that word today earlier, the operation itself of creating a PFDD would actually bring the community together. I've always said that sometimes we need the cause or that straw dog for us to unite and get together behind. And this could be another way of actually giving voice to members in our community that no longer have that. Next slide. So these are the practical adaptations and considerations. We're looking at transportation. How do we get people there? Many of these PFDD meetings they want in person, because it does make a difference. We understand that it could be, frankly, virtual as well. But ideally, maybe it's a hybrid. We're not there yet. But I think most of us would agree that when we get together like today, this could have been hybrid, this could have been virtual, but it's better that we're here face to face. It's the conversations in the hallways. It's all the things that we get to know each other and better understand each other. So how do we do that? Well, any of you have traveled that sits in a chair, you understand that's a challenge. You got family, you got your whole routine, you got care. These have to be represented, and if we move forward on a PFDD journey, frankly, and look at all these things that we have to consider, and the most important part is probably cost. Cost is a lot. It costs a lot to be spinal cord injured. We know that. And it costs a lot in terms of the time it takes out of our family and friends to help us be spinal cord injured and survive. So all of this has to be considered when we roll this in. Not every condition has to deal with this, but we do. So that's what helps people maybe understand when we get to the point of what is this thing going to cost. Think of this right now. If you want a true representation of the community, we have to consider this point. Next slide. And then, of course, I talked about diversity. This is such a big, important thing. We all understand now that we're really looking at how we can incorporate EDI in everything that we do, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Frankly, us at the NASCIC level is dealing with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And one of the projects that we've taken on right now is looking at the misrepresentation of certain groups in clinical studies. You know, we want to be the people that help engage the community. We want to build the capacity of advocates in research, but you're not doing it properly if you don't have us all together under the same umbrella. And then that's the tent that we're trying to build together. And so when you're going through it and putting together a PFDD, you have to try to make sure that you've done everything you could systematically to reach out to the community. And I think many people in this room know that where the community is misrepresented is due to history and really a big lack of trust in our system. And we have to start to rebuild that trust. But by doing that, we have to empower people to let them know that their voice is going to be heard. And it's not a token voice. We don't want that. So when you go into a PFDD meeting for what it's really worth, their voice has to be heard. So the fourth question is, what are the organizational and financial considerations? I've kind of gone into that a little bit in planning this. So you can see there's an example. You got to look at caregivers. You have to look at the patient, I know I'm using patients, probably, please don't tell anybody at home I did this, but we understand it's the FDA nomenclature, but to bring together the community groups, we have to be able to identify that. And not, I almost made the mistake of starting to name them. That would be a huge mistake because I'm going to miss somebody. There is so many great organizations, and there's going to be room for all of us under that tent. And that's what we're going to have to do, is galvanize that group and bring them together. And that's what we're going to do. And we have to bring together all the stakeholders. That includes the medical product developers. It includes practitioners of research, and of course the FDA itself. I too, Jonathan, don't want to see one person without a tear in their eye after that PFDD. They need to know, and we're going to hear more about it tomorrow, about what it's like living with a spinal cord injury. And it ain't no picnic, but there's a lot of great people that have been fighters for years, and they're there to tell their truth, and I think that's going to be so important at a PFDD meeting. I heard two words today that excite me in ways. I hear engagement, engaging the community, and that is a theme. Well, we're riding that bus. We are on that one, and we're taking that one home. Engagement is so important to research. Everybody that's got any worth in industry have all starting to figure that out, that if you don't engage the community at the beginning of an idea, chances are for success are lower than it is when you try to bring them in to the last minute to run a study. It doesn't work that way. Hope. Hope is a big deal. Again, 38 years and counting. Gone through many roller coasters of hope. But one thing I do know, these are good times. This PFDD is a great opportunity. But more importantly, it's you people in the room here today, and you're going to be asked upon to help be part of that hope. But what I like to call all of you, you are the navigators of hope. The people in this room today can be the navigators of hope with people with spinal cord injuries, and please do not forget it, and I want you to wear that as a badge. Very important. And again, the last steps we talked about was we need our stakeholders to align. You've heard that. We need to commission a representative. I think we know that. And we think we need to prepare a summary of the state of the science. And maybe, Linda, am I taking your slide? I don't know if I did. Okay, it's my slide? All right. And the one thing that we talked about earlier, there's a lot of great publications out there that have talked about the preferences of our community. Well, let's bring that together first so we can shape the questions better so that that PFDD meeting can be the most efficient and most exhaustive to make sure that nobody is left off and we can really capture all those things and get the endpoints right. And we need these informed by the results of these surveys. These surveys that we need to put together, built on what we already know. And there's a lot out there. A lot of great research has put us in that place. But we need to take that survey and make it so robust that it really does capture what people want for preferences, which then builds into the famous, what we call the PFDD meeting, where coming from that meeting, we can then help direct, and as we've gone through the mechanisms, what a PFDD really means, the FDA gets it, and they understand our community, which more importantly would encourage investment into research in our community to see some great things happen and build upon that hope. That's an exciting thing to think about. This is good. This is a big deal. Brian, I'm loving what you guys did in putting this together. It is such a big deal to be here today because we are on the cusp of making and turning another big page and moving this thing forward. Again, you as navigators, keep that in mind. You can make some history this week. I mean it.
that's it for this part of the presentation. Thank you, Barry. I just want to say one last thing before Brian yanks me off. I look at this effort as maturity within a condition. We have had many clinical trials. We've had varying degrees of success. But to me, this reflects the maturity of spinal cord injury as a community in really integrating the voice of the patient. And Barry said, am I taking your slide? And the answer was no, because this effort needs to begin and end with people living with spinal cord injury, with consultants as they see fit. It may be people with outcome measures, physicians caring for people living with spinal cord injury, but it is an effort driven by people with spinal cord injury. And hopefully it will help prepare our field forward. And I'll be quiet now, Ryan.